I'd love to hear from other task force members about their experience with letters to the governor. I mean, I've been on the task force for a few years now, but I know Ben and Bob, y'all, we've been on it since the beginning. So I'm just curious to see if you know, the way the governor's letters have been sent has been pretty consistent these last 10 years or so, or if there's been fluctuations in sort of response.
The not going into the history of history, but about 10 years ago when EJTF was really getting in, we wanted to do more than just our annual report that the statute requires. We wanted to be more reactive to the needs of the community, to direct what their concerns were directly to the governor. And it wasn't in the statute, but it was the leadership decision at the time. And Ben was there for a lot of it, and Robin Morris-Collin was there for a lot of it, that, well, we're just going to write a letter to the governor. And so we would do that, and they began to have more of an impact on it. So we became more careful with that. But we never had a process of accountability. She did react, he did react, various governors over the years. We've been under 3 governors as a task force, and they would react, you know, respectfully. They wouldn't really mail directly back to us, but now this has evolved because EJ has evolved because of climate change. And so these letters need to be formalized, and the Superfund letters, you know, I've written probably over half these letters, you know, and then other people have written many letters. And so no one ever, you know, wrote me back personally. I don't take it personally, but nonetheless, it's the issue of the letter. What do we really mean? It means we want to communicate an interest of that community to the governor. Now, the threat of a letter has the same communication power as the actual letter. I don't want to be in the position of backing into the threat of a letter. It's too consuming of our capacity. So that's a brief history of it. Ben, do you have something to add?
Not much. I mean, I think your reflection is accurate. I mean, I think there's a couple things that letters have served really well. And I like that Jim is really pushing us to think about a process flow for both how we identify what elevates to a letter. You know, certainly it fits within our authority to advise the governor, and we've used letters as a way to both, as Bob said, reflect what we've heard from community, but also to put forward kind of EJTF's perspective or asks in very specific ways. And so that's important. And the other thing I would just mention, and I think it relates to both letters and maybe going back a little bit to broader communications, that, you know, I know that letters have also served our community partners and advocates well, right? Where folks can reference a letter from the EJ Task Force, reference, you know, the stance that the EJ Task Force or the issues raised around environmental justice concerns that EJTF has brought. So the, you know, the compiling of letters, both for historical record and public record, but also I think for the utilization for community is really beneficial. And then the only other thing I just, you know, not to go back too far, but, you know, I think one of the things that we probably need to decide in Part A under communication standards is that, you know I've gotten emails, I'm sure Bob and others have gotten emails, well, directly from community that we might respond to. We need to probably include governor staff on all of those emails for public record retention. I imagine there's emails that have gone back and forth with constituents, at least I know I have, that are saved because I had to save my records for the county, but are not saved necessarily for the governor and the state retention records. So I think we probably have missed some of that stuff and put us a little outside of some of the retention rules. So we might want to build that into a kind of a permanent practice, is that we're CCing, you know, someone from the state who's retaining those records for our legal obligation.
It sounds to me that, I mean, to be able to have a better understanding of the process and how we can, create a process that it's effective, that it's transparent, where, you know, people who have interest in those issues are engaged in that process. I think it's helpful for me to understand kind of the internal process. So once the letter gets to the office of the governor, you know, does the advisors read those letters? And so I'm just wondering what's happening behind the scenes, so that way we, you know, can create a better process for us. You know, I feel that the letters that we have sent to the governor, they're important letters. And I feel that sometimes those letters are just a way to elevate the issues that haven't been addressed by, you know, the state agencies. And so I'm just trying to have a better sense of what's happening once it gets to the governor's desk.
I'm assuming you'd like me to answer that, Valentine. So once, depending on what is in the letter, the governor's office takes a bunch of different steps. So the initial process is, you know, governor takes a look at that letter. It goes to the policy advisor that touches on the issue. A lot of times that's either me, Jason, Kristen, or Jim. If it's a natural resource focused item, if it touches on anything else, it goes to the appropriate policy advisor. And then depending on what the request is in that letter, then we either elevate it further by communicating with the agency about it, or just taking it into account for our own purposes about how we would address the situation. So if it's like a community need, I'm trying to think of a good example. So the letter that talked about like the scrapyard fire from a couple years ago, that actually helped elevate that issue to the governor directly. And as you know, some legislation came out of that effort. And I personally was working to make sure that that bill was informative of community needs with the legislature in the speaker's office. If it's more like informative, like the COVID letter, for example, it gets brought up the chain to the appropriate policy advisor. So at that time, trying to think of who it was, there's like 3 different health policy folks right now. So it's that team. And we were actually like already working on items to address the issues in that letter for COVID response, particularly for farm workers. And I think we talked about this last time. And instead of responding back to the task force, we just like acted because it was just like, oh my gosh, we have to like get this done and figure this out for this population. So depending on what the request is, it usually leads to that, or, you know, even a conversation if it's something that needs to be addressed specifically. But each governor's office has like a different approach, I'm assuming, in responding to letters, and agencies as well. So it might be helpful to know from the task force what you'd hope to get as a good response if you send a letter to the governor.
I appreciate you saying it. I think that the tire fire that happened in Coley, like, is a really great example, as you mentioned, of like us responding to an issue and then it getting addressed very quickly. I know it did result in some new rules, and like in DEQ, had to respond. I mean, one in of itself, like that event was just catastrophic, and the impact to the Coley neighborhood and surrounding neighborhoods were pretty devastating. So I don't want to take all the credit, that our letter sort of helped out, because I also know that, Verde and other EJ organizations are also, really pushing hard. But again, it's like, I would think it'd be nice as you mentioned, when it does get passed off to someone, whether it be to you or to Jason or some other policy person, just for us to get something back that says, hey, thanks so much for your letter. Like we've passed this on to so and so. They'll be in touch.
I really like your suggestion, Cherry Ball. I think that many people come to us with different issues, hoping that the EJ task force could elevate those issues. And so to the extent that we can receive some sort of confirmation from the governor's office that, that the letter was received, and then they have, forwarded the concerns to the correct, state agency, or that they'll, have a discussion about it. I think getting something back so that way we can share that back with the community. I think it's really important to make people feel that they're being heard on those issues.
This is Bob, and this might lead into Jim, who I think just got on. For a letter, you need a letterhead, and we don't have a letterhead. Jim did design a letterhead that looked very nice, but to send a letter on a blank sheet of paper doesn't really have much sway, no matter who signs it. So the formalities of the institutions we're dealing with would have to raise our standards to a letterhead. But I did want to point out that practicality, and with a staff member, we could handle some of these things with more accountability, especially for records retention. Thank you.
Hi, all. I just want to chime in. I think I'm here now, but I just want to see if, can you hear me?
You are back.
Welcome.
All right. Thank goodness for a spouse and another computer.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I'm sorry. I've been trying to follow, but I've been in a phonetic panic to go through control panels. So I'm not totally up to speed. So let me listen in for a little bit. But from what I've kind of heard is, I just heard Bob talking about the letterhead, and Ben about some issues about, the professionalism and how we look and how we communicate. I think that's kind of important. As much as I'm not into how people look and clothes you wear and things like that, I think it's important for an agency of the government to look like and have the respect of the agencies that it's working with. And I guess that's part of my quest to try to maybe move us into more of a professional looking direction. I also heard some talk from Joel about tracking the letters, but I've been logging on and off and resetting my computer. So I kind of missed that section as to if we have a tracking system or if we've been able to follow or discern the last letter we talked about and its workflow through the system.
Thanks, Jim. Do other folks have any comments or thoughts about letters to the governor? Okay. Amir, what do you think about what I proposed? Is that something you think that would work?
Yeah, I think that could work. One item that's been pretty underutilized too is the EJTF email account. So it might be helpful, just going back to Ben's comment about the public records items, to also use that folder, that account to have these communications internally. It would also be helpful for me to have, Jim has been really great, but I think we need maybe 2 more people to help keep these items on track and just help me formalize them so that we can kind of check off the box. Like with the letterhead, for example, I think we have a draft letterhead ready to go. It's just a matter of requesting that to be used. and approved by this group.
Amira, I don't know how extensive the list you're referring to is, but is it the one that includes annual reports?
Yeah, so it's this list up here.
I see. Well, with the annual reports, I'm
Yes.
concerned that we might lose that in the legislation. And Oregon's been doing this, well, we were passed in 2007, but we've been doing it, and it's been a long struggle, Ben can attest to, uncomfortable struggle, but the agencies, through their goodwill and learning over time, have done annual reports available on the web that many Western states use. And so I want to make sure that we can get a structure for that, or whatever you need to, but without that degree of accountability, I think we lose some credibility, and I think all the stakeholders lose accountability with that. So this has helped us transcend governors. You see, by having annual reports, new governors can come in and see what the lay of the land is for EJ for agencies. So I just wanted to make a plug for that. Thank you. And I'm willing to help if you need to.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I probably should know the answer to this question. Are the annual reports submitted to the EJ task force, or are they submitted to the governor? And I asked that for a couple of reasons. One, if they're submitted to the governor, maybe that's a separate conversation. If they're submitted to the EJ task force, what we have never built in is a formal process. I mean, they're just sending it, right? And I actually thought this year's looked amazing. Maybe it's just it was formatted really nicely, but I actually think the agencies did a really incredible job of kind of putting that work together, particularly with all the constraints of COVID. What I think has been missing is they're not presenting that to the task force, right? I don't think we've ever issued a response. I don't think we've ever really built in a formal kind of agencies are going to present on their annual report, where we're having a dialogue, where we're looking to see where agencies can improve, both in what they're reporting, but also areas that they're lifting up as successes or lifting up as models for EJ. How do we best capture that, give feedback, constructive criticism, all those type of pieces. So I don't know how to best track all these kind of pieces that we're discussing this morning, but I'd really love to strengthen that piece. As Bob said, over the 10 years, we've seen kind of ebbs and flows in terms of the quality of those reports, the timelines, all that stuff. But, looking back over this past year, I feel like it's probably the best demonstration we've ever had of agencies basically across the board. And I won't say finally, but, agencies who have gotten to the place where they're able to really articulate the relationship of their agency's work and EJ. Which I think is powerful. And I think the next iteration of that work is a more formalized, and it gets to what Jim was saying, right? That, you're not just submitting this into the ether, you're submitting this to the task force as a conversation, you're presenting your annual report, which adds, we'll have to build the space and time for that, but I would just put that out as a comment and a recommendation going forward.
Ben, this is Courtney. Just wanted to address one question I heard in there about kind of the confusion from some of the agencies. Since kind of the last confusion, I have updated the website a little bit to incorporate more of the statutes on there and who is statutorily supposed to be submitting to. It's also in the statutes that it's annually to the Environmental Justice Task Force and to the governor. So I can also give those links, but just to let you know that I have put some links in there to help with some of that confusion about what the statute actually says. So just wanted to give those 2 cents there.
That's super helpful, Courtney. Yeah, I mean, the reports it doesn't feel formalized in a lot of ways. The agency reports are gathered like Courtney and me, and I believe most agencies also send it to the task force members at the same time. And then those are compiled and sent via email to the task force. But because there are I think maybe 12 different agencies that are statutorily obligated to do this, plus some that take it upon themselves to be engaged in this work and just submit, even though they're not required to do so, which is awesome. It is a lot to read and get through, and that, you know, you all are volunteers, so I can imagine it's a lot of work to try to read through the reports and give constructive feedback, as Ben was suggesting. So oftentimes we have a few hours slotted for during the task force meetings that where agencies can come and give those reports. And that has been useful and I believe good in the past, but it also takes up a lot of time away from the task force to focus on like internal work or hear from community as well. So just something for you all to think about in how you want to set up a better structure for receiving and reviewing those reports.
Do we have a list of reports on the website right now from previous years? Do we have like a inventory?
They are all up there under past meetings and reports. I think they go back to 2008.
Okay. No, because I know we get reports on a rolling basis, but at some point, whether it be at the beginning of each year or at the end of each year, it would be nice to sort of get some summaries, you know, or just review, I guess, some of the reports, especially the ones that have some pretty exciting stuff in there. Because I've perused through a lot of the reports, and you know, sometimes I see stuff in there that's really exciting and really encouraging, especially for agencies. I'm thinking in particular, I think one time we got a report from the Department of Forestry, and I know Andy's here, so it was specifically about, you know, warnings when it comes to wildfires, right? And I know after they got a report from EJ Screen, you know, from the EPA, like they started using that to try and figure out what areas of the state they needed to begin providing wildfire advisories in different languages. So to me, things like that are like really golden pieces of and examples of why the EJTF is important. And I think it's important for us to highlight them and not just let them sort of sit in, you know, this long list of agency reports, you know, because we've got a ton of agencies that report to us. So you'd have to really look at each one to find things like that. So even like sort of best hits of, you know, of 2020 or 2019, I think would be really useful and a really great way to bring up some of the influence the EJTF has had on agencies and how they themselves are changing for the better. Anyone else have thoughts on the agency reports? Okay.
I think actually there's one more thing. So in previous years, well, actually there are two things. So I kind of want to address the timeline issue. When I first started this role, I think there was a deadline out there for the reports in my first year that I passed. And then the year after that, agencies had been asking me, like, when are these reports due? And honestly, I threw out kind of like an arbitrary-ish deadline, sort of around past deadlines. And I think it was like March or April. And then in 2020, you know, COVID kind of put everything behind, and I felt like it would be unfair to ask for agencies to submit something at that same time. So I had shifted the deadline to be, I think, mid-July, in time for the August the August meeting. So I think it would be helpful to figure out, for the task force to figure out like what date would be best for you all to write them, whether that's the end of the year or the end of the fiscal year. That could help with some confusion and standards about how the task force is conducting their work. And then just like memorializing that somewhere. We're not creating bylaws, but somewhere in these standards, and just have it be that in some sort of process in case there is an emergency like wildfire or God forbid another pandemic. So yes, those are my just general thoughts about that. And then I feel like in the past there have been questions about like what exactly to include in the task force report, like what type of information the task force would like to receive. Kind of looking to Ben and Bob to see if that assessment is correct. I thought there was a list of questions from the first reiteration of the task force about what they expect agencies to report on, but I believe that is also shifted to what Bob just mentioned in the chat, where agencies are kind of left to interpret what EJ is and how they're addressing it, which they have done a pretty good job of, actually. Yeah, Bob, if you want to talk about your comments in the chat, that'd be great.
The rules as they evolved were really focused by Jason when he was our help from the governor's office. And they developed into somewhat 6 basic questions over time. The questions, what we tried to do early on was have the questions for each agency come from the community via us. We wanted to be the direct voice as possible for letting the communities come to their own questions and have each agency answer to that community. That's a direct tie that Senator Abel Gordley had when she developed this. That's the kind of tie that she wanted. So it was a kind of idea that was resistant to a unified structure for every agency, because that doesn't address all the community problems or misses some that we might have out there. So that's why there's been a resistance to it. As the agencies grew and become more forward with this, they wanted a uniform standard. All the natural resources wanted a uniform standard about EJ reporting. I'm still a little resistant to that personally, but I understand where that's coming from, because the voices of communities span different agencies in certain issues. So I didn't want a community issue to be siloed into, well, that's DEQ or that's ODA or that's, you know, and our communities don't have the capacity to get blurred across all these natural resource agencies. So to be a space for the agencies to detail their interaction with specific EJ concerns and at the same time provide a structure, I think is very important. In terms of embracing growth, I think from the structure that we have is that it's about a B- structure in terms of the questions we ask. It needs to be greatly improved. Those questions were not developed with the voice of community enough, I think. And so as we move to climate change and the legislative evolution of EJ and EJTF, this will be an issue. And so I don't know how to articulate it more than that, but it's an honest concern for agencies. What they push us to, as you know, Amir, and most of the panelists know, is some metric of this. And they all, you know, we get from uniform reports, and then we get to a metric, and then we get to the metric being controlled by the agencies instead of the community controlling the metric, and we lose power that way. So that's somewhat my concern with a unified standard to Oregon's natural resource agencies for an EJ report. It doesn't catch other things, and it may co-opt some of our community power with that. That's just Bob's opinion on this. It's some of the history of it, but I still feel the tension of it even more so these days as our communities are unable to participate even with all the opportunities that we have, which gives us a stronger role. And we have to have the agencies report. We have to have a standardized way, but I don't want to get it to pushing a metric where we have to measure how bad it feels to have your baby cry at night. And so that's me flapping my gums. I'll shut up for now and let other people talk.
Mr. Jim here, finally can log in. Hi, everybody. Just to give my 2 cents, one going back to the time frame of the reports. Now, when I worked for the state at Eastern Oregon University, we had budget cycles. And within that cycle, we as directors had to give our supervisors our annual reports along with our budget requests. Now, I don't know how other state agencies work, but usually when you build your budget is when you reflect on the work that you have done in the past. So my suggestion might be is that a quarter after the budget cycle is to ask folks to maybe give us their reports. Not because I don't want to burden them, because when you're building a budget, that's really a tough time of the year, because usually you have your internal goals, your internal metrics that you're trying to justify and then build a budget around those. But if we were to ask them for their reports a quarter after that, they would have had the chance to reflect, look at their new goals for the next fiscal year, and then maybe more adequately be able to respond to us. Just my 2 cents there. And as far as Bob, like I hear what you're saying about how we don't want to kind of necessarily pre-prescribe the type of report information we want. But I think we kind of want to set some guardrails, and then in between that, allow the agencies to tell us what they think they did that was good, so that each agency is its own experiment unto itself in environmental justice, and we all learn from each other within that process. So how to create that, I'm not exactly sure, but if we kind of get the words out here in the public ozone, so to say, then we'll be able to better narrow them down to something that might help us all move forward in a coherent but yet eclectic way.
Thanks, Jim. Anyone else have any thoughts? Folks you haven't heard from yet. Just curious. Yeah, the only other thing that's on my mind is our relationships with agency advocates. I know in the past, Bob, and Ben, you all have tried to create relationships with agency liaisons or the heads of agencies. So I guess I'm curious, moving forward with this potential of us getting some more investment in the EJTF, if it makes sense for us to continue to sort of work through our agency liaisons. Amir, I'm also curious to hear from you about how the EJTF interacts with other agencies. Like I said, I've talked to some agency heads. I've also talked to a number of agency liaisons, but none of these relationships feel super formal besides the agency liaison that comes to our meetings, once a quarter. But in between those periods, what kind of conversations, Amir, do you have with agencies regarding EJTF? Like I said, I have a few, but just curious.
Yeah, well, you all are very popular, and I think that's great. Folks want to get your expertise and time to inform their agency work in a variety of different ways. I think recently we've seen that show up as whether it's in a rulemaking capacity to help with community engagement and input in that way. Yeah, and from what I can tell, it seems like agencies are very enthusiastic to provide these annual reports and show that they are committed to equity and environmental justice. I get quite a few emails to request that are requests to the EJ task force about engaging with either a rulemaking process or a community process, or trying to have that feedback and input on agency programs and work that they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And Jim, this might be something you want to speak to, because I think that's also something we haven't done a great job tracking, right? That, where have we given feedback? Where and who do we have representing, various committees or rulemaking bodies, et cetera, right? There's not kind of a single place where we're actually tracking the amount of input, impact, contribution, and capacity expenditure that EJTF is providing for the state of Oregon. And sometimes that's just an email response. Sometimes that's months of someone like Bob working with an agency, right? I mean, we have no way to really quantify the amount of contribution and relationship that we've had with agencies. And I know, just scanning my own email, right? We get, as you said, Amira, we get a lot of requests. We just got an email from Department of Ag around the soil and water conservation districts, right? So there's, it's kind of a constant flow, but we're not really tracking it. And, at some point, whether you're asking for an office, whether you're asking for more capacity or more resource, being able to somehow capture or quantify the contribution that EJ Task Force members are giving to agencies, to the state of Oregon, quite frankly, is going to be important. So I know that's something, Jim, I know you've talked about, like, how do we even track, who's serving on what, either directly or by proxy, who's, provided, where have we provided feedback to agencies that had questions, where have we, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think it's a good example of the type of relationship that exists, but it's also something that, as we start cleaning up our processes and developing some structures, is a really important place to focus on.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. These are really good questions, but I guess, my mind, the bureaucratic mind that I have goes to, a database. But when you look at database designs and the work that we're doing, it doesn't fit nicely into the little square fields that exist in an Excel spreadsheet. So how do we take the work that we do and try to boil it down to kind of something in the beginning more simplistic that we might be able to track? Something such as, like, if Elmira or people that get requests, to maybe have a shared database, and that when we get a request or an email from somebody, we just kind of maybe just go there and log it. And just in the beginning, just something simple as just logging things to kind of start to get a feel of what are we being asked by who, and what type of time does it take to respond to that? Because for right now, I don't have a sense, because we're all individuals and we all kind of do our own things that are either directly or indirectly related to this task force. So how do we start to create a log of what are we doing, and not necessarily how are we doing it, but who's the request, when, and then just a short description of it. And maybe I could work with Elmira to maybe kind of talk about that, to tap into her brain, because I think she's our switchboard. So you probably have the most common knowledge of what's coming into the switchboard. And then maybe we could just have a little half an hour dialogue and start to go, okay, what is that? And what are the data points that occur in that discussion? Because we can probably find 6 or 7 data points that are common to everything. And then maybe just start to put them on a shared Google Drive. And, some of us will use it, some of us won't, but some data is better than no data. And it might give us some insights. But that's just kind of, starting from nowhere. That's kind of my initial thoughts of how do we start to quantify kind of, what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Thanks, Jim. I'm seeing our time, it's 10:15, so I'm wondering if we should also talk a little bit about our strategic plans and the work plan updates. We talked a little bit already about our public service image. We talked a little bit about needs and resources for staffing. I know that the racial justice coalition has some really great asks for the EJTF that specifically came out of the Environmental Equity Council. And then we also have to talk a little bit about engagement with our advocacy commissions. So Amir, maybe you could give us a little update about some of those needs and resources requests that were made to the Oregon Racial Justice Council.
I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question.
We had I think it was, Ben, you and I saw it from Tony DeFalco, who served on the Racial Justice Council. There was, when I think about needs and resource staffing, I know there's a request or a proposal within one of the subcommittees of the Oregon Racial Justice Council, specifically for EJTF.
Yes, sorry about that. So the idea is to, in creating the Office of EJ, the idea is that the task force would live within that office and would be staffed by at least a director, because you need a director if you have an office, a research analyst, and a community coordinator. And then there would be funding to provide research, and I don't think we really talked about grant funding in a big way at that table, because when you're starting an office, you need to have a certain amount of capital to get that up and going. It's a fairly simple request and straightforward request. Are there any other details or questions you want me to pull out?
No, Ben, if there's anything else you want to just tell folks about our conversation with Tony, because I know he serves on it and he's the one who brought it up to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was, how do you get EJ dollars from the state into community, and trying to develop an appropriate structure using the EJ task force as the kind of governing body of the district for the distribution of those resources. So, it was a combination of kind of creating an office structure, and I think where that lives and is a different question. But, I think what Tony was really imagining, and from the community perspective, is, having an office with dedicated resources distributed by the EJ task force to ensure that EJ dollars are going directly into community, was kind of the crux of the idea. And this has been a conversation I think we've had for a number of years, really thinking about, where does the EJ task force live as it, in theory, grows into a kind of formal entity. And we've lived in the governor's natural resource office, I think, since its founding. And I think there's, certainly room for conversation about, is this a distinct Office of Environmental Justice? Is this a, enhanced resource within the governor's office, natural resource office? Or is this, some other place in the state infrastructure where the EJ task force would be housed with appropriate funding, administrative and leadership support?
I'm not sure if you want me to comment about the level of support within
Yeah,
like, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't know how much you wanted me to say. So currently, as you know, Courtney and I are supporting you all, and for me personally, you know, it's been a point of pride and passion because this is really my area of expertise. However, you know, I do have a lot of other duties within my role as governor's staff that have to get done and are part of the reason that I got hired. So it's, even though I would like to devote all my time to the task force, it's been a struggle to do that, especially now. This year, 2020, has really been incredibly challenging. To put it lightly, a dumpster fire. And on top of like the typical duties that I have to conduct, there are additional requests like COVID response and, you know, responding to other emergencies like the fire stuff that, you know, is still being talked about, even though the fires have gone out. My thoughts behind being in an agency instead of governor's office is, you know, first of all, if there is a transition of a governor, the next governor or future governors might have other priorities or other things they want to focus on, and it might not necessarily be the task force in the way like I'm working with you, you know, like going to every meeting, helping coordinate those meetings, working with you individually. I don't know what the level of engagement would look like. I would hope it would be the same, but you never know. Within an office, there is immediate like support resources to help with the function of the task force. Other commissions and advisory bodies are located within agencies, and they do have people who are dedicated to doing that work and coordinating those bodies. Whereas like I have all these duties and this is like one of them. So one of the major benefits to being in a natural resource agency over being in a governor's office is that you would have more support and infrastructure to help you all do your work.
Yeah, I
That is a
appreciate,
pretty sad statement, but
no, I appreciate that analysis. I appreciate that analysis, Amir. I know Joel and I talked a little bit about, you know, what would it mean to live in an agency, which I don't have strong feelings, but I have feelings against, right? You know, if we took an agency like Department of Environmental Quality or Oregon Health Authority or one of those type of bodies, you know, I would really be concerned about kind of navigating an agency politic and then thinking about how then we would relate to other agencies. So I certainly see the limitations and, you know, long-term, you know, liabilities of being housed in the governor's office for any number of reasons, including legislative allocation of resources. You know, I know I've talked briefly with our Commission on Black Affairs about the possibility of imagining the EJTF, the advocacy offices. I know we're hiring a new director as we speak for that body of work. EJ Task Force and the multiple advocacy commissions obviously are written together into statute in this case. So, you know, if I think that's a really fascinating conversation to have, right? And, you know, the idea that we're going to get a bunch of resources for the governor's office, I think 10 years has shown us that, you know, as much as we've appreciated the resources we've had, we seem to always be competing with a bunch of other needs. And so, you know, I don't know if the reality of a standalone office is something that actually can come to fruition. But I would caution us strongly to go in a direction of living within a natural resource agency. That's one of the 14 that's required to participate. So I'll shut up, but I think where we live in the state is a really important question as we're trying to build resource and long-term sustainability to have power and impact and influence.
I appreciate that, Ben. Thanks, Amir, for your comments. I just also want to, right, like part of what this conversation entails was how we talk to engage with our advocacy commission. So I've been making an effort this year to try and attend at least one, if not two, advocacy commission meetings and form a relationship with their chairs and vice chairs. But it's been difficult, and so I think we also talked about the possibility of EJTF being housed within the Advocacy Commission office. But there's a lot of things that feel like they're in the air, right? Like we have the Oregon Racial Justice Council and this proposal to create sort of an office of EJ, which should be a sort of I think an ideal home for the EJTF. At the same time, if that doesn't happen, there's still the question of we still have 2021 to deal with. So do we move over to DEQ? Do we move over to another agency? Can we be temporarily housed in an advocacy commission office? So a lot of things in flux, but a lot of things for us to think about and consider. I appreciate everyone's input.
Yeah, I'd like to just share that an idea we had talked about earlier, but kind of seemed like it wasn't that probable, is us to write our own grants. I do think there would be money available for what we're doing. I did notice that the Commission on Hispanic Affairs was able to accept donations when I scanned all the pages a couple of months ago. So at least I know one group was able, they had a donate page, they could take a credit card, they could do things like that. I think we should start to look at ourselves as more of an independent, semi-autonomous, I should say semi-autonomous organization that maybe is housed in natural resources. Omira, I clearly see your thinking there as to where you want to be when the political waves hit. And it's nice to be not on the first wall that's going to take the hit, meaning the governor's office and staff. But I do think we should look at more of being self-independent and trying to move ourselves away from any agencies to be more independent and therefore possibly impartial. But that's just my thoughts, because I just see us going round and round in the same circle, in that there's not enough resources to fully fund us. There are other very important issues that come up during the time that get more attention, but we're kind of in the background chugging along. And I just think that in order to continue that, we have to look at self-sufficiency. And I guess I'll continue to kind of sit on that branch of the tree and say, let's write grants, let's see what we can do. And sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you for your comments, Jim. One thing, if we do decide to, write grants, and one thing I would caution us is that, we would be competing with our other EJ organizations, on funding that may be more effective in getting the job done than the EJ task force. That would be my only cautions.
I think that's a really good point, Valentin. And if grant, I think, Jim, you were talking about if the task force could apply for a grant. Is that what you were saying? To get additional funding?
I really had no particular ideas of any grants, just a matter of, I just know for our work, you just kind of go out and you start to look at the literature, see who's funding what. There's many corporations that do different things. So you just got to get out there and just look. And I think for environmental justice, I think that is a topic that is gaining more and more attention in the times that we're in. But also with Valentin, I hear what you're saying is we don't want to compete with the frontline people that are really doing the work. We're kind of more in a policy enabling situation, as I kind of see, and we're not frontline. And I would hate to see us take away from the frontline folks.
Well, I put this in the chat. I appreciate that comment as well. And I do think we have some history where, we got some funding. I say Meyer funded, Opal, Beyond Toxics, maybe some other groups, but at least those two, a couple years back, that resources didn't flow into the EJ task force in that circumstances, but there isn't any reason why we couldn't structure a grant differently, right? Where some dollars were going into community, some dollars, at least for administrative support perhaps, or other types of supports for the EJ task force. And I put this in the comment, but I'll just raise it that, the advocacy commissions have our yearly joint meeting where all the advocacy commissions come together on December 4th. And I do think this would be a conversation worthy of having. And I think for several reasons. One, as Jim pointed out, and I don't know what statutes allow for example, the advocacy commissions to raise individual contributions, and whether that applies to EJ task force or not, I have no idea. But Jim is absolutely correct. You can make a donation to the Commission on Black Affairs, and we are able to raise both individual dollars, grant dollars, and other kinds of funds. But I think this would be a great conversation. I can work on my end to ensure that the conversation around the EJ task force, the relationship with the advocacy commissions, and kind of a conversation about, what that structural relationship at the state would best look like as we work and move forward. And, last thing I'll say about the advocacy commissions is every single one of them have two elected representatives from the Senate and the House. And so there's a natural legislative relationship, there's a fiscal relationship, there's a policy relationship, and there's a statute relationship. So I will make sure to put on my notes to ensure that this is part of the conversation on December 4th. We might want to talk about that further later, but I think it's a good place to have a discussion.
I appreciate that comment, Ben. I will kind of reiterate that, our current statute for the task force doesn't really inform the things that you're talking about, grants or raising money in particular. And again, I just want to reiterate that in order for this body to do that, you kind of need to have a better structure staff-wise that can help and support you in doing that work. Once I have that final language of the LC, I'll share that with this group because it does talk a little bit about functions, and it's actually very similar in structure to the Oregon Invasive Species Council that does have power to provide grant funding to external folks. And I think they do apply for grants, but I need to check on that.
Thanks, Samira.
But
Thanks,
again,
y'all.
square one, getting more support.
Yep. I think with that, looking at time, I want to make sure we get to our next bit. So maybe one more round of comments if folks have any, and then we'll take a little break.
One thing I just wanted to bring up, and again, I'm sorry for my connection in the beginning, but I think I had mentioned at another meeting of us maybe setting up a Google list or something like that for the communications within ourselves. Because, if you have a Google list, one is you just reply to the list and you make sure you go to everybody, but it does keep a record of all the emails so that you do have an archive of sorts. And I don't know if people find that it's hard to kind of, because you usually go to an email and reply to all. And we found at different times, some individuals will fall off that list until somebody really looks at it and puts them back on. But I'm just wondering if a list like that could be beneficial and be an archive to our communications. So I just throw that out there because I'm in an ODOE docket right now and they don't have a list the way the PUC does. And we've got 53 contested case parties on it, and people keep on getting left off because people reply all, and then somebody falls off the tread, so to say. So I'm just mentioning that as another way, if we go to creating shared libraries, shared documents, moving to, I'll say the Google sphere, but OneDrive from Microsoft, they're all kind of the same. They're out there, they're free, and it might be a better way to try to coordinate our work. Now, I don't know, some of you that run organizations, how do you do group communications? Because I know, we'll put up a PDF document, people will work through it in comments, or a Word document through track changes. So I'm kind of looking at is how do others do group work and kind of keep your communications kind of in another box, so to say, because I'll admit I am awful at filing documents, and I really rely on the search function to find my stupid stuff. And I find that if it's in a Google Drive, there's less stuff to look through to find what I'm looking for. So that's my fallacy. I don't organize well.
Thanks, Jim. You're not the only one. Amir, I guess I'm more curious because I know that the governor's office and state agencies, I don't imagine use Google Drive. You use Microsoft Teams and other stuff, right? More Microsoft oriented things. How do you all, is there a way for you to create an email that goes to all EJTF members?
Yeah, definitely. I can find out about that.
Okay.
And make that happen, Courtney.
Sweet.
Because then that also ties in, and I'm sorry if I missed it if it wasn't spoken about, but we also talked about getting us EJTF emails that show that, our communications are kind of official-ish. And that could be part of this whole process of moving us into another workspace. And because if we're going to have, say, a spreadsheet that tracks incoming requests, we're going to have to have a place where that's shared, where, like, if I get an email from a constituent, I can log it in. And so therefore that has to be in a shared space somewhere. I would rather it not be out in the Google sphere or the Microsoft sphere and protected within the state, security system of communications. But, if we can't get there, there are other options that we could look at.
Thanks, Jim. All right, gang, let's take 5 minutes and then reconvene at 10:45. Sounds good. Thanks, y'all. Great. Hey, folks, welcome back. Hope everyone got a chance to stretch, drink some water. We're going to move right into welcoming our guest. Mark, thanks for joining us. He's going to update us on a little bit of rulemaking, so I'll pass it over to you.
Hey there, you able to hear me all right?
Yep.
Right on. Hey, everybody. I got a couple things I was hoping to run through today. First, I just kind of wanted to give you a general introduction to who I am. For those of you I haven't met yet, it's an honor to be part of this team effort. It was cool to sit into some of the earlier deliberations you guys are having. Thanks for the work that you do. It's a very thankless thing in so many different ways, devoting time and energy to this important work. So thank you for that. I'm going to give you just a real brief overview of the Clean Air Oregon regulatory reform process. Stop me if it's too basic or if there's stuff that you've already gone through. But I guess the primary reasons that I'm here before you today are both to just give you a general introduction to who I am. I'll let you know, for those of you who don't know, that I'm the representative for the Environmental Justice Task Force on the upcoming Cleaner Air Oregon Advisory Committee, and to hear your questions and your input, to take those before the committee and the agencies that are moving through this rulemaking endeavor. So my name is Mark Riskedahl. I'm the Executive Director of NEDC, the Northwest Environmental Defense Center, based up at Lewis and Clark Law School, when we're not just living in our virtual realities. The organization's been in existence since 1969. We've done, the primary focus of the organization is to protect the environment, natural resources of the Pacific Northwest. We spent quite a lot of time over the prior decades focusing primarily on clean water, but over the last 10 to 15 years have been spending more and more time dealing with clean air. We were the original plaintiff that started building the momentum to bring litigation against Portland General Electric concerning operation of PGE Boardman. That ultimately led to the conclusion just recently of the shutdown of that coal-fired dinosaur. So we do litigation like that, but we also do lots of really boring, wonky regulatory work, and this fits very neatly into that category. So I just got a quick thing there. The organization again is the Northwest Environmental Defense Center. It's an independent 501c3 nonprofit corporation, as opposed to an agency. I'm not a government employee. I don't work for DEQ or OHA. Those are the agencies that are shepherding through this current rulemaking. So that's just a little quick bit about me. The Clean Air Oregon regulatory reform effort was really thanks to the vision and leadership of the governor during a really difficult time. There was, for those of you who have been in Oregon for a long time, and I know that most, if not all of you have been, there was a fascinating Mosque controversy in Portland just a few years ago that ultimately centered quite a bit on the Bullseye Glass facility in Southeast Portland. What was happening was there was evidence emerging that there was significant emissions of air toxics in different spots in the Portland metropolitan area. And unfortunately, there was no existing regulatory scheme to reduce or limit those toxics. And people were understandably irate about that. Like, how could there possibly be all these facilities in neighborhoods all over the city, all over the state for that matter, that were emitting pollution? Nobody knew how much pollution, nobody knew what pollutants. It was kind of a ridiculous scenario. And so we pushed to try to get a new program developed. And it was a big uphill political push because there's no federal mandate that this type of a program exists. Many states don't have a state-specific air toxics, industrial source-specific regulatory program. Oregon didn't, and now Oregon does. So I, along with Hui and some other folks that have been before you in different times to talk about this, participated in the Clean Air Oregon regulatory reform development effort, spent lots and lots of time in meetings, preparing for meetings, going to meetings, ultimately was able to get enough momentum behind that machine to get the program up and running. The program's running now. Slowly, it's being rolled out. Oregon DEQ and Oregon Health Authority, DEQ and OHA are the primary agencies implementing it. So there's kind of two different avenues. One is this facility-specific work that's being done at sources around the state. And then there's this ongoing regulatory reform advisory committee effort to deal with the actual rules that support the program. So what's happening with this new rulemaking? There's the first meeting that we're going to be having with this new formation of the advisory committee or reformation of the advisory committee is November 10th. And the agencies are spinning it primarily as a harmonization between a whole suite of existing air toxics rules that have existed on the books forever, and the new suite of air toxics rules that came into existence with the passage of Clean Air Oregon rules by the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission. So we're quite interested, NEDC, my organization, is quite interested both in the significant public health implications of these emissions. We're very concerned that there not be any rollbacks, regulatory rollbacks. We're seeing just wave after wave of those at the federal level. It's an interesting dynamic in Oregon where even if that's happening at the federal level, Oregon has committed to maintain the regulatory protections that were in place at the time that Trump took office. So we'll be sure to be pushing this time through this new rulemaking, but there not be any rollbacks or kind of going backwards. We're only moving forwards is the goal and objective. And I don't, I'd be happy to get into the specifics of the program itself. There's lots of acronyms. It's really wonky. The advisory committee is comprised of a few attorneys. They're all industry attorneys, and then there's me. I'm not a practicing attorney, but I went to Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland. Community partners. I'll be definitely having conversations with Hui. I'll be having conversations with Tony and others, and there's lots of kind of neighborhood specific interest in facilities like Owens Brockway is a facility up in the Cully neighborhood that there's a lot of neighborhood concern about. Precision Cast Parts is another one of the facilities that's been called in, one of the early industrial sources that have been called into the program. So there's some early work being done with that facility. There's a really interesting requirement that there be community engagement in a way that there hasn't ever historically been. It was something that Hugi and I and others pushed for really hard in the development of the rules. There's really no other example in Oregon that I'm familiar with in an environmental regulatory program that requires the polluter to sit down face to face with the community and to talk about what they're doing, to kind of lay out the list of all the different pollutants that they're emitting, and then for the community to have some opportunity to provide some feedback. It's a frustrating dynamic in some ways, obviously. I mean, any amount of air toxics are toxic in certain amounts. And so, you know, there are always folks that live next to these facilities, understandably, who are like, I don't, you know, the only acceptable amount of you know, acrolein or whatever the specific pollutant is in my backyard, in my garden, and for my kids to breathe is none. It's like, why are we authorizing any of this? So the purpose of the program is to limit those emissions to safe levels. We're going to see how it rolls out over time. And yeah, that's just a little bit of intro into what it's about, what we'll be doing with this new advisory committee process. I'll be happy to come back and report to you after that first meeting takes place on November 10th, if you'd like. And yeah, I just want to open it up and hear your concerns and thoughts and ideas, so I can be sure to share them both with the other community partners that are on the advisory committee and then in the advisory committee meetings.
Thanks, Mark. Folks, feel free to unmute yourselves or just put it in the chat.
Chair, yes, I have a couple of questions, and I want to see the specifics into all the weeds, no matter where they are, but not here now. The general thing I'm concerned about is a thrust toward justice for our communities. And there's two concepts that are important here that in the years of, I'm looking at meeting notes going back to 2017 where you and Hugh and other have talked about this, but I haven't seen there anywhere is the precautionary principle as applied to public health. And I know this is not the part of a narrow set of regulations where you're on a rack and they control the dialogue very completely. I've served on racks. But it is an EJ issue that needs to be out there for climate change and climate justice. Another issue that's academic, I won't go into it much, but it's the state, for those who are not aware of this, that it's always the EJ communities that have to be proved that it's bad for them, whereas the wealthier, generally white communities, politically through land use and other mechanisms, just say they don't want it. They don't have to prove anything. So I think it's incumbent on our proxies to stress this fact, you know, that everyone should have to prove the same thing we prove. And it's very unfair to have the lowest capacity, most broke community be the one that has to go to science court and prove it beyond whatever standard they meet. And so that those two fundamental things, precautionary principle and a fair burden of proof for scientific causality, will go a long way toward environmental justice. Not your bailiwick right now, but there's as a proxy, those are big themes that we want all our proxies, in my view, to stick with. So thank you for your time, Mark.
Yeah, of course, I'm totally on board with those. Those are all great points. This program, really more than any other regulatory program in Oregon that I've seen, does integrate some semblance of the precautionary principle. There is significant presumption that facilities are causing harm to communities, and then the burden shifts to them immediately to discern, to prove that they're not causing harm. That's sort of a different dynamic than we're familiar with, where every facility is just accepted to be doing whatever it's doing. It's got a permit, it must be fine. As long as it's complying with the permit, everything's fine. unless you're right, as a community, you're able to demonstrate through some expensive, time-consuming effort that that specific facility is causing some specific harm to you personally or to your neighborhood. So this is a really big step for Oregon. It really is an exciting thing to see. You know, how it plays out ultimately remains to be seen, because the program's been slow to roll out. There's only 20 facilities, a couple of which I've already mentioned that have been called into the program at the very early stages of it. There's 20 more that are slated to start rolling in as well. A ton of emissions inventory work and modeling and you know, pretty science-heavy stuff goes into each of these analyses. We're going to be trying as much as possible to work with community partners to engage in the Cleaner Air Oregon process for the first few facilities that come out, and then build kind of a roadmap or sort of a kit for folks in other communities around the state to use, knowing that it's going to be hard for me. I mean, it's me and one staff attorney, and with the help of an attorney up at Earth Justice in Seattle, who's we're pulling into this effort as well, to try to build some capacity. But it's hard for us to kind of engage in each of these communities all over the state as they're simultaneously moving forward. We're going to try as best we can, but we'll try to put some stuff together to help people make sense of it, because it is technologically complex.
Quick political question, cap and trade. How will this data, all your research, all your wonderful efforts across the state, helping plug up many holes in our legal capacity, but how will this fuel cap and trade? The main concern is that they'll just continue to dump emissions in communities that have already been dumped on, particularly the African-American community in downtown Portland. And there's lots of promises and funds and economic development, and we have a bundle of things we're going to do for you, but it's still no answer on whether it'll be less emissions. There's one California study, if you don't have it, I can share it with you. It was developed by a conservative economics think tank in Boston that says it might help. But I'm concerned, this is, as you know, the fight. The same people are involved with that, are involved with this. What's the engagement with cap and trade? Is it separate, outside? What's your relationship with the current cap and whatever they call it discussion?
Yeah, it is separate. It's really a very siloed effort to focus strictly on the air toxics that are emitted from the specific individual industrial facilities. So it kind of divorces those toxics from their broader emissions profile from the conventional pollutants that would be implicated in analysis related to the cap and trade program. But that's a good, it is a good reminder. I'll need to get myself up to speed on what's happening with cap and trade and see to what extent there is overlap. We partner a lot with other folks up at the law school, the Green Energy Institute, and others that are more involved in the cap and trade stuff.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple. Just make a couple comments. So first, Mark, thank you for your willingness to kind of dive into the depths of this type of complex rulemaking. Certainly, just to lift up Mary Pivotal, Neighbors Who Clean Air, spoke really highly of your work and relationship. And so I appreciated her making that connection for us. Certainly I think you've already kind of stated some of this, but to the extent that you can keep us apprised of where you see the EJ task force and just kind of put a pin in the back to say, where can I use this group to help leverage, to help lift up, to help make the cases that you'll be arguing for, I imagine, around that table. And then just to expand on some of what Bob said, the other concepts certainly that we have talked about as a group is the cumulative impact, right? And obviously regulatory environments are kind of toxic by toxic, facility by facility, which doesn't actually account for kind of the human health impacts of multiple toxics and exposure for folks in community. And then of course, I think the broader, and I haven't tracked this for a number of years now in any great detail, but one of the frustrations I think I had in past work around air toxics was, cancer risk being just an unbelievably ineffective and inappropriate mechanism to talk about health protections. And so I think this gives us an opportunity as a state to redefine what a health standard is, and cancer risk per million is bullshit on its face. There's so many intermediate, I shouldn't say that, we're public space here, is not an effective standard, right? And really understanding the kind of journey along the way towards cancer. And so when we think about health impacts, even inflammation being an indicator, which gets to, I think, Bob's comment around precaution, right? But, if we can combine kind of precautionary principle with, those intermediary health impacts, up into, cancer risk, it would be really helpful. So I'll be interested to hear kind of how that conversation goes, and, for, you as well, Hui, and others who engage around this process. But I've often felt like that is not an appropriate way to think about health risk when we're really looking at only long-term complications related to cancer risk, and not some of the intermediary and inflammatory responses in the body that would tell us whether folks are actually being impacted. So appreciate the work that you're doing, and look forward to kind of seeing how we can best engage to really seize this opportunity to create some health standards for the state of Oregon.
Any other EJTF members have questions or comments for Mark? Okay. Well, thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. Yeah, I remember when Precision Cast Parts was first blew up way back when. And I think I participated in some of the initial Cleaner Air Oregon meetings, and yeah, it's been a doozy of a ride to get to this point, but I'm very excited that it's going to be moving forward, and that we're going to be trying to take some really real steps to try to reduce, air toxins. There's a lot of more work to be done, but I thank you for coming and giving us a little update.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It was great to meet those of you that I haven't met yet. And there were a few questions that popped up. I wasn't able to track them all, but if there are specific individual questions that you still have, my name and email address are easy to find on the web. Just shoot me an email and I'll respond to you that way, or we're happy to talk to you personally through a call too, if you have follow-up questions that you weren't able to get in today.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everybody.
There is actually a question in the chat. Sorry about my video. From Jen, and I posted it in there, and it was, I know the program is about hazardous air and pollutants, but given the pending federal rollbacks on the NAAQS or NAAQS and CAA, are there ways that the program can help boost a robust state program / state capacity to ensure that we are protecting folks from conventional pollutants regardless of federal law?
Yeah, those are great questions. There's a couple different parts to that. This program, as I said earlier, does exist in sort of the universe of a state-only program. There's no federal overlay or minimums or maximums. What Trump does, if he, God forbid, gets a second term, does to the Clean Air Act or to air regulations generally will have no effect on what Oregon's doing in this program, and we'll make sure that that's the case. I think that there are some co-benefits in a lot of scenarios for pollutant reductions for that target and focus specifically on emissions of air toxics to other types of pollutants. Oregon's also starting to move through the regional Haze program too. We were very involved with that back in 2009 during the last round, and we'll do that again. Some of the very same facilities that are targeted through the Clean Air Oregon regulatory reform process are also targets of the federal regional Haze program. And that program gets a little bit more at some of the conventional pollutants that Jen referenced in her question. So yeah, it does have the ability to, I think just to reduce NOx and SO2 and other types of pollutants. It doesn't directly target those, but there's likely to be significant innovation and progress. We're talking about some real dinosaur facilities. If you ever drive by the Owens Brockway facility on a clear day, you can just see the pollution plumes going up out of there, and that some attention to reduce the air toxics at that facility through the mechanisms and the tools and the technology used to do that is also going to have the co-benefit effect of reducing other pollutants that would be of concern, smog forming pollutants, for example. All right, thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Mark.
Enjoy
Appreciate
your
it.
virtual day.
All right, gang. Let's go ahead and a little behind, but I want to make sure that we get to hear from Elise from the Washington EJTF. So, Elise, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Thanks for the thumbs up. My name is Elise Rasmussen. I am actually in Seattle right now, and I am the project manager for the Washington State Environmental Justice Task Force. I'm super pleased to be here this morning with you all. I've been working and talking pretty regularly with Amira, and it's been just really nice to, hi Amira, it's been really nice to just kind of share learnings and resources and just discuss together, you know, across state lines for like the shared vision for environmental justice. And so I'm really pleased to be here with you all this morning. I am going to attempt to share my screen. And so just give me a second because PowerPoint always is a little bit funky with me. So let me, 1 second. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. Let me pull up mine.
This meeting is being recorded as well. And there are almost 24 other attendees. So if you get, maybe we should save questions until after you're done. But yes, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay.
It disappeared for a second.
Yes, it did. Here, my notes disappeared. So now oh, you probably cannot see it. Hold on 1 second. It's really being funky. Okay. And Amira, how much time do I have? Because I know you guys are running a little behind.
I think we have 30 minutes.
Okay. Awesome. And just give me just interrupt anytime if you need me to speed up or slow down. Now can everyone see it okay? Okay, awesome. So like I said, my name's Elise Rasmussen. I manage the Washington State Environmental Justice Task Force. And just today, I'm gonna focus mostly on the recommendations that were developed by the Washington State EJ Task Force and less on the process of the task force. In addition to the recommendations, the task force had an intensive community engagement process, for example. But my goal is to have time at the end so that you all can ask questions and feel free to ask any process related questions then. First, I want to just say it's important to acknowledge that this work was temporary and it was convened through a budget proviso in the 2019 legislative session. So the task force had a little over a year to get a lot of work done. And on top of that, obviously, COVID-19 presented several challenges to the process, which included limiting the number of in-person meetings that we were initially scheduled to hold all across the state. But with that said, the EJ Task Force in Washington came up with a robust set of recommendations to help build the infrastructure in the state in state government to better address EJ head on. Also, before I start, I want to just take a moment to recognize that the fight for EJ is ongoing. It did not begin with the Environmental Justice Task Force, and it won't end with the EJ Task Force. Just a note for timing, the task force was met for the first time in end of September of 2019. And actually just yesterday, we submitted the report to the governor's office in Washington for approval. So that just gives you we had basically a year to get all of this done. But I want to express our sincerest gratitude to the communities that really informed this process, especially the communities the majority of whom are Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color across Washington state who have been fighting on the front lines for EJ. The task force had greatly benefited from their community knowledge, wisdom, expertise, and our hope is that communities see themselves in this report. And we just acknowledge that every step closer to EJ in Washington is because of the power that communities hold. So I just want to start with that. Here is just a screenshot of the membership of the Washington State Environmental Justice Task Force. You'll notice that our two co-chairs were from, actually, it might be hard to tell, but in Washington, these are two kind of community-based co-chairs. We have the Governor's Interagency Council on Health Disparities. That was one of the co-chairs. And then also an organization called Front and Centered was the other co-chair of the task force. And they really lead the state in understanding environmental justice issues across the state. And they're actually a coalition of a ton of different organizations. You'll also notice that the task force had pretty broad representation in terms of agency membership. And then some membership also from the community-based organizations, from the Black community, from the Latinx and farm worker communities, and from the Asian and Pacific Islander community. We also had labor and union representation, and we also had some private interests represented as well, such as the Washington State Farm Bureau and the Association of Washington Businesses. I want to really take a moment here to point out that we were not successful in getting tribal representation on the task force. And tribal indigenous people have been caretakers of these lands since time immemorial and have been among the strongest EJ advocates. And so I just want to acknowledge that there are obviously inherent gaps in these recommendations without the invaluable expertise, knowledge, and wisdom and perspectives that tribes and indigenous people bring to the EJ conversation. So we reached out to several different tribes, and for reasons that I'm sure we are all aware of, it was just tricky to get their participation due to the ongoing and historical legacy and trauma that government has played a major role in harming indigenous communities. With that said, we did get communities, indigenous communities perspectives throughout our community engagement process, but they were not ultimately at the decision-making table, and that is a limitation of this process. One thing I want to also just point out is that we have a diversity of perspectives on this task force, as you can see, and so consensus was never really the goal, but ultimately, in the end, we did have unanimous approval and adoption of the final report, and I'm proud to say that we have some pretty far out there, and I would hope radical recommendations that came out of communities that we were able to bring these private interest folks along with us, at least to a certain extent. And so it was awesome to bring those folks along. Okay. So like I said, the task force was convened through a budget proviso, and there are 4 required study areas that legislation, that the proviso mandated that the task force provide recommendations on. So the ultimate outcome, desired outcome, is that state agencies integrate EJ into state agency actions and decision-making with the goal of eliminating environmental health disparities. You'll notice pretty upfront that the recommendations are really like high level, almost bureaucratic. And I've really enjoyed getting to know what you all are working on, the Oregon EJ Task Force, because you're really getting more into the nitty gritty, which is where I hope that Washington continues on that path. But right now, I think Washington is really focused on building up the infrastructure across state government to more appropriately and adequately address EJ. So we're going to go over each of these 4 buckets, but so the first set of recommendations, and I'm kind of combining these 2 here, are model policies and measurable goals, both for reducing environmental health disparities, or I'd like to say eliminating them is the goal. And then also to provide recommendations for the environmental health disparities map, which I'll go into in a little bit, but it's a cumulative impacts analysis map. It's an interactive, publicly available tool, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so how state agencies can use that map to identify highly impacted or overburdened communities. And then the fourth bucket is the community engagement and best practices to eliminate barriers, structural barriers to promote meaningful and authentic community engagement. But before I get into that, I want to also say that the EJ Task Force did a few different extra credit projects, one of which was creating a statewide EJ definition. And I'm going to read it out loud because it builds off of the EPA's definition. Several task force members said that they wanted to keep that definition intact because obviously it is tied to federal funding, but the task force enhanced it. So the first sentence is the EPA definition, and then the second sentence builds off of it. So it's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that's the EPA. And then the state task force added on and said, this includes using an intersectional lens to address disproportionate environmental and health impacts by prioritizing highly impacted populations, equitably distributing resource and benefits, and eliminating harm. And so that was really just a couple things on that is that, many EJ definitions exist and no single definition can perfectly capture the expectations and goals that communities have been fighting for decades. But the EJ Task Force developed this recommendation and by adding on to the EPA's definition to include the outcomes that they wanted to see in Washington state. This definition is really meant for Washington state agencies to be adopted. So community definitions may be more appropriate in other contexts, but this is really a state agency and state government definition. In addition to the definition, the task force created a set of EJ principles. These 5 principles are meant to serve as an initial blueprint for a shared vision for EJ in Washington state. The following principles were informed by communities across the state and with recognition and reflection of the principles of environmental justice adopted at the 1991 First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. The EJ principles section in the report, which will hopefully come out sometime soon, pending the governor's approval. But in the report itself, it defines these principles more in depth and helps to operationalize what we mean by this. So it includes also actions that state agencies can take to work toward each principle. And so I'll just take a moment to pause and have you guys take a moment to read that. And we can go back to this during the Q&A if y'all want that. So now I'm going to dive into the recommendations. Like I said, there was model policies, measurable goals, environmental health disparities map, and then also community engagement. The task force decided to kind of merge measurable goals and model policy recommendations. So we're going to just consider that one bucket because they have the same desired outcome, which is to eliminate environmental health disparities. And so this is an overview of those measurable goal and model policy recommendations. So these recommendations are further organized into 4 categories that name the intended outcomes that the EJ Task Force would like to see enhanced in state government. So namely, improving accountability to communities. That was something that we heard throughout listening sessions across the state. Incorporating EJ into government structures, systems, and policies. Another thing we heard, investing equitably And then finally, improving environmental enforcement. And I'm going to go into each of these more in depth, but I think it's important to note, because I just mentioned this, I think it's important to note that the task force was super fortunate to have a half-time community engagement coordinator. So that community engagement coordinator was half-time with our task force and half-time with another task force in our office that was focused on standing up the Office of Equity for Washington State, which I'm proud to say is happening and is underway. And so those two sort of task forces really complemented each other well, because, you know, if communities were interested in talking about equity, our community engagement coordinator could then say, and then, you know, one part of the equity pie is environmental justice, or if communities were interested in environmental justice conversation, our engagement coordinator could then talk about equity more broadly. And so we got a lot of good feedback that was complementary to each other. So let's see. So the first set is improving government accountability to communities. The first one is about measurable goals, and it's really about tracking and communicating progress. So this recommendation is that in partnership with communities, agencies should create a standard method to develop, track, and evaluate and publish EJ and health-related goals focusing on pollution reduction, eliminating environmental health disparities, and improving community engagement. And so it was really hard to come up with a measurable goals recommendation, because obviously each agency has their own specific purposes and functions. So it's really about agencies creating their own goals. But under each of these recommendations, we have a set of strategies and considerations for implementation. So we go in and give some guidance around how agencies can then create these goals, and what transparency would look like in measuring progress towards those goals, either by agency specific or enterprise wide, to see if agencies working together can get closer to those outcomes that we want to see. The second recommendation is a model. So really there's one measurable goals recommendation. It's that. It was really hard to develop that. So now we have several model policy goals, or recommendations, which I'll go into. The second one is to create a permanent EJ work group, much like what Oregon has. Like I said, this task force was temporary, and there really is no place in Washington state government at the moment for communities who are experiencing environmental justices to come to state government and say, this is what's happening. A lot of times communities are getting the runaround of saying, that's not my jurisdiction, that's not what our agency does, et cetera, et cetera. And so by building this shared leadership model with agencies and overburdened communities both at the table, the hope is that these recommendations can then be implemented, but also be further refined to actually get to the environmental justice issues that are happening on the ground, such as specific recommendations around farm worker rights, specific recommendations around tribal sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. We also think that the permanent EJ group will create a much needed community of practice for agency members or staff who are really working hard on the EJ front, but feel kind of like an island in their agencies. The second bucket of these model policy recommendations are about incorporating EJ into government structures, systems, and policies. So third recommendation is about embedding EJ into strategic plans. So right now, there are no, as far as I know, and I think I'm feeling very confident saying right now, there are no agencies that specifically state environmental justice in their strategic plans. I'm happy to say that some of the agencies represented on this task force are already working on this internally as a result of being on the task force. So some agencies are making progress. Some agencies have mentions of diversity or equity in their strategic plans, but nothing specifically around environmental justice. And to be clear, when I say agencies, I really mean all agencies, because all agencies touch the environment in some way, shape, or form. However, putting on my realistic hat, the hope is that agencies who are, natural resource agencies or agencies that touch public health, that they would be the change makers here, and that we could then umbrella out to other agencies over time. Number 4, to have dedicated EJ staff in state agencies. Currently, there are a lot of people in Washington state government who know a lot about EJ, who are focused on EJ, but don't get to do that as their full-time jobs and are pulled in several different directions. As far as I know, there's only 2 people that I have interacted with in state government who their full-time job is environmental justice. That's what they do, that's what they know. And that's like what their role is in government. And so it's really about getting those people who understand equity more broadly, but really understand the discipline of environmental justice specifically and can speak to that and can be subject matter experts. And ultimately, the hope is that there are people that are coming from communities to do that. And really, what we're hoping for here is that, each agency works differently, but that these dedicated staff would be supported by leadership and potentially be on leadership in agency or directly connected to it. Number 5 is now we're getting really into the meat here. So this is where we get sort of started talking about, legislative action would have to be part of this work, starting in number 5. So that's about incorporating EJ into state environmental laws. And I want to just speak up to that a little bit. So right now, there's a lot of different ways to do a bill analysis, for example, and environmental justice needs to be one of those ways, right? So EJ consideration should be so actually, let me back up and say, first of all, EJ considerations should be incorporated into a range of state environmental laws. So we also have, like Oregon, a Growth Management Act, and that's an example. We also have a state Protection Act, for example. So there are these examples of environmental that need to specifically be in there, and that is what this recommendation talks about. The other half of this recommendation is that and natural resource state agencies should consider EJ in developing agency request legislation, analyzing bills during legislative session, and conducting rule reviews. All right, I'm going fast, I know, but I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. So then we get to investing equitably. Number 6 is about the required use of an EJ analysis. And EJ analysis is a term that isn't well defined, at least to my knowledge. I'd love to know if you all have a good, solid definition of it. But really, it's about just considering environmental justice in decision making. And so agencies this recommendation really speaks to requiring EJ analyses, including, but not limited to, the environmental health disparities map, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that combine cumulative impact of environmental health indicators such as environmental exposures, environmental effects, impacts on sensitive populations, and other socioeconomic factors. So number 7 is about just equitably distributing state environmental investments. So using the map, there are census tracts on the map that are defined as a rank 9 or 10, meaning that they're the most impacted communities. And so when the state is looking at how to spend its environmental investments, like putting those communities at the top of the list for those investments. Number 8 is around contracting, so that contracting prioritizing high labor standards and diversity. So ultimately what this recommendation is about is that work that is funded by state environmental investments should increase inclusion in contracting with minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses. And there's a whole effort going on in Washington state around this. So really the EJ task force was just building on this effort about contracting diversity and saying, yes, we agree with this, and let's do this for environmental investments as well. One thing I want to mention, because it really comes into play here and later on in the set of recommendations, is that Washington state voters have decided, Washington state voters have an interesting history with affirmative action. Currently in state government in Washington, state government is not allowed to do any form of affirmative action. So you cannot contract solely on the basis of race or gender. And so that is a barrier, and that's something that you have to get creative about, but that's something that I just want to point out as a difference probably between our states here. Number 9 is about reparations. And so this was something that, in our current context, but also before that, communities of color, particularly Black communities, have been saying for forever that they're owed reparations. And that came up over and over and over again in our community conversations. Obviously, this was a super controversial recommendation to pass through, but ultimately it was unanimous. And really, I want to just point out that I'm sure you all know that in California, they just passed a similar piece of legislation about studying and developing proposals for reparations. We did not get that far about developing proposals. We tried, but we didn't get that far. But just that the state needs to study opportunities for what reparations can look like in Washington and how that's directly connected to environmental justice, through redlining, through land theft, through slavery. These are all interconnected. We don't live in a vacuum. And in order to do environmental justice right, reparations needs to be a part of that conversation. Moving on to the last set of model policies. So these are really about improving existing environmental enforcement systems and mechanisms. So the first is around ensuring accessible enforcement and reporting processes. And so it's not about creating new processes, it's about making sure that, that these processes are elevated, communities have elevated awareness to addressing and barriers are addressed. So right now, these are just online forms for reporting environmental violations, and these forms are 100% in English. So it's how do we, so in that recommendation, there's a number of ways that the EJ task force calls out to make these reporting processes more accessible and available to communities who need them. And finally, number 11, support for supplemental environmental projects. And really the call out here is that, that these supplemental environmental projects where the, alleged violator of the, who has done the environmental harm, that the projects be done in those same communities that experience the harm, that it's not throwing money at a problem and saying, I'm good and I don't have to, I've washed my hands of this, but it's no, getting those resources or money directly into the communities that were harmed in the first place. So that is that, and oops, I'm sorry. So I actually have quite a few slides, but I want to stop here because I know I went over a lot. I just want to say that I have, I'll go to the next slide and say that I have recommendations for how to use this environmental health disparities map. I also have recommendations that we can talk about that have to do with community engagement, but I'm also noticing the time. So maybe I'll just stop and see if folks have questions here, and I'm happy to come back at any point and go over these other recommendations too.
Thank you, Elise. That was great. A lot of information in a short period of time. That was awesome. Let's take some questions. And is it possible, Elise, to get a copy of your presentation?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you for your presentation. Just quickly with SEPs, wasn't really popular with EJ in the Gulf South because what would happen is, without going into what a SEP is, I used to teach that, is that the wrongdoer, and usually they're a waste company, they would go in and they would not hire anyone from the community. They would do what they want, which meant a parking lot for one of their commercial establishments. So I'm glad you're pursuing that because there's a lot of opportunity there, and maybe the timing's better than we did that. The other question, and Environmental Justice Task Force, we're statewide, and we have a strong Eastern Oregon concern politically, as you do. So I was wondering if poverty is a consideration for your environmental justice programs and outreach. And it's very expensive and hard to go to rural areas, as Ben would know, as most of us would know that have been trying to do this for years. So those are my two just comments. And there are EJ analysis models, and Amira can point you to some of them because she's shown them to me in other meetings. So
Wonderful.
But thank you so much. It's so exciting. I know a lot of people on the names that you listed there, and it's just wonderful to hear your enthusiasm and hopefulness for an EJ task force there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it.
I got a quick question, and I'm sorry if you had covered this. I'm exposing my multitasking and inability to pay attention to several things at once. It looked like on one of the earlier slides that you didn't have a tribal representative yet. And I'm curious because I think that's been one of the biggest gaps for the EJ task force here in Oregon is the relationship and intersection, both with kind of sovereign nations, but also with, urban native folks, even in EJ populations. So it looks like it's unconfirmed from a tribal leader. Where's that? I guess, what are the barriers? I mean, I think we're in a similar situation. It's a unique relationship, of course, government to government. But I'm curious kind of how you all are thinking about addressing that. And like I said, it's been a real gap for us. We've had some opportunities, particularly with some communities, and we've met with some tribal leaders in the past, but not in a consistent basis around the table. And I think that's one of the things maybe we're sharing in terms of a gap. I'd love to hear kind of your reflections, or where do you see some of those challenges arising for you all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing I'll say is that I'm fairly certain that the barriers are similar, if not the same. They're in many respects, maybe not in all, but in many respects, it's this is a task force. Tribes are sovereign nations. And so it's like, do you want to spend your time on a task force as a sovereign nation? Maybe, maybe not. Obviously, the other part of it is the, ongoing and historical trauma that state government has played a role in. And, do you want to engage with your oppressor? Maybe, maybe not. Another part is that, this task force was 1 year long. So fortunately, our community engagement coordinator has several relationships with tribes that have, gone back actually decades. And so he was able to get conversations there. But this task force was 1 year long. There's no way you can do actual meaningful relationship building in 1 year long endeavor, especially amid COVID, where we can't meet in person and where the reservations, for example, were closed off. We couldn't go there. And so I would just say that, one of the things that needs to happen if tribes or other indigenous people or urban native people, if they're going to, really want to be engaged in these processes, it has to start with relationships that are, previously existing relationships prior to this year-long temporary task force. The last thing I'll say is that, tribes in Washington have been on task forces in Washington state. And what I've seen is that, the recommendations never go far enough for them. So it's like, why, spend time and energy if that's not going to be like, you're not going to go where we need you to go. And so, in a nutshell, that's what I would say some of the barriers are. The other thing is that we needed to have, obviously someone who was a tribal leader on tribal council. And so we couldn't, someone who can actually represent the tribe. I would say though, one other thing is that even if, we did get a tribal leader, which would have been, absolutely a game changer for this process. It's, tribes are not a homogenous group. They're each a sovereign nation. And so it's like we really need to have more than one seat, obviously, at the table for them. So I'll say that.
No, I appreciate all of that. I mean, I think about Portland, right, which is the 9th largest urban Indian population in the country, which I don't think people often realize. And so there is the kind of formal tribal relationships, the government to government relationships, right? There's the voices of the different folks on the res. And then there's just this gap. And we see it in our work in so many different areas, that engaging Indigenous folks in public process, in EJ work, it just seems to be a big question mark that we're all kind of trying to navigate. And that, that might not be universally felt around this table, but, certainly I think for the EJ task force, we have struggled over the years, even as we've had some successes engaging around very specific issues, like water rights, for example, things like that. But yeah, I appreciate your analysis. I think you're spot on.
And one thing I'll just add to that is that now that this report is kind of finalized and we're at the end stages, I am getting a lot of pings from tribal staff to talk more about the recommendations, and then they're going to see if tribal council would really want to hear more of this. So we are trying to still see what. If whenever they want to be involved in the process, I'm going to drop everything and do what I can to share, learn from, and discuss with them. So yeah, we have a couple of conversations and discussions lined up, and we'll see how those go.
Yeah, this is Valentina. I'd like to go back to one of the recommendations. I can't remember what number it was, but it was improving enforcement and reporting mechanism. It seems to me that, given the limitations that you have, some of those recommendations are really important. I think they're key to continue to learn what are the issues that are impacting our vulnerable communities. And so I think that improving enforcement and reporting is one of those tools that we can use to really understand what's happening in the community. And so I'm very glad that that's one of the recommendations. I know that there's a lot of limitations with our current reporting systems. I know that some of our state agencies have a complaint-driven process where people don't complain. They're not out there conducting enforcement and conducting investigations. And so this is really a critical recommendation. I'm wondering whether the full report is available to the public. I'll be interested in taking a look at it.
Yeah, sorry, was that a question, Valentine? When it would be available?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it would be available to the public.
Yes, thanks for that question. So in terms of timing, I can't give you an exact date. We just submitted the report to the Washington governor's office yesterday, and so we're waiting their approval. And then once that's approved, we will definitely be making that publicly available. And actually, that reminds me, let me go, and I can put this in the chat too, but let me go to this slide so that you can take my my email address down. And if you are interested in being on our email list so that you'll know once this report is publicly available, just feel free to shoot me an email, or actually what the better one would be so that it gets directly there is this one up here. And you can just, oh, I'm sorry, that's not even an email address. You know what? It's okay. I'm going to take care of it. So just email me and I'll make sure you're on our distribution list, and then you'll know once it's publicly available.
And I'm sure Elise will let me know when it's publicly available.
Absolutely.
And I can communicate that to the members. But definitely, shoot Elise an email if you'd like to be on the listserv.
Yeah. And I'll say also that there is legislation that's being written right now that takes these recommendations. So this task force was convened because a piece of legislation didn't pass all the way through in 2019. They were able to negotiate this task force. So now it was called the HEAL Act, and so now they're writing a HEAL Act 2.0. And so I say this because, you know, there's real work happening here in Washington, which is exciting. And also for a timing piece, like I think the governor's office is trying to get this out there before our legislative session starts in the winter.
Thank you, Elise. I appreciate you hopping on and joining us today. I also just wanted to quickly just get a thought from you. We know that Senator Merkley, along with Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, are doing a federal EJ legislation. We had a chance to hear from a little bit from Senator Merkley on our last meeting, and I'm just curious to see if you are tracking that and thinking about working in coordination with Oregon and also California. I also know that there's some wildfire coordination happening within 3 states, so I'm just curious to hear a little bit about your perspective from a regional standpoint, but also from this larger federal movement of doing real EJ legislation.
Yeah, Mary and I have talked about that legislation. It's awesome. So, you know, from a personal standpoint, like personally in my free time, yes. From a career standpoint, my job ends at the end of the year. And so that's something also to keep in mind is that, you know, this like in terms of the capacity that I'm able to do in my current role, I am really trying to prioritize connecting with communities who have informed and guided our work to close the loop with them. And that's really what I'm working on. Another side note is that I'm also going to be supporting my supervisor in staffing another task force that's focused on a social equity program for cannabis in Washington state. So that's kind of my next chapter that I'm working on for the next couple months. And so we'll see how you know, based on funding, if she's able to keep me on for longer. But I just want to put that out there that I'm really only around for a couple more months. And so if there are ways that that I should be plugged into that work that you're speaking of and ways like opportunities for collaboration, I'm all ears with that caveat that I might not be around for that much longer to help in this role.
Sounds good. Thank you, Elise. Appreciate you joining us.
Yeah.
It is 11:51, y'all. So I want to quickly transition us to public comment if we have any.
And I'm trying to unshare my screen. So hold on one second. There we go. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's really great to be on, and please do email me if you want to chat further. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Elise.
Do we have any public comment?
So I asked folks if they have something they wanted to ask to raise their hand, and I don't see any hands raised. You can also indicate in the chat if you have something to say. Okay, so Rachenda, this is a good amount of text, and I want to make sure that you are able to talk. So I'm just going to allow you to speak and share your comment with the group so we can all hear you.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I had just wanted to introduce myself because I'm here representing the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, the Creation Justice Committee, and they have recognized the environmental justice work as being really important for Oregon and for the folks of Oregon. And so I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing, and just to let you know why I'm here, and that that you're being noticed and the work matters, and we care about that. And thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you for being here. And thank you for asking questions throughout the meeting. They've been really useful.
Yeah, email's great. Thanks, Rachenda. Anyone else? that case, we'll just move on to closing and final thoughts. I'll open it up to EJTF members to share.
And I'm sorry, Chair, I actually have one question that I wanted to return back to that was asked a really long time ago in the chat. And it was about the executive order climate work that is continuing to happen. And as you know, agencies have produced their reporting in response to the executive order, and the interagency work group on climate impacts on impacted communities is continuing to meet. And I think we have maybe 5 or 6 more meetings until the end of the year. And then that group will be producing their recommendations about how to incorporate climate justice principles into their work and also advance climate equity within their agency. I would probably say that's the biggest update, and I apologize I didn't bring that up as part of my update before.
Thanks, Samir.
Chair, I don't know if we're meeting tomorrow, so at the risk of ever suggesting another meeting, I do feel like there's some things that are outstanding. I actually would be interested in agency updates. I know we received some of them via email, written updates. I would be interested in hearing about COVID impacts and response, particularly Oregon Health Authority. I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more from ODA around the Soil and Water Conservation Commission and representation around soil and water districts. As Amira just stated, the climate blueprint work, I'd love to hear more about that. I know Valentine, you might want to talk to us a little bit about Oregon OSHA rules that are really being adopted and whether those are going to be effective and supportive, particularly for farm worker populations. And then I do think, clarifying some of the decisions from our earlier conversation would be really important. Everything from, how do we track and meet our public record obligations to, finalizing the cover letter, template to, some of the other administrative tasks that I think we discussed. And I think I'd love to have a bow wrapped on some of those things, because I don't think we made any formal agreements, and we certainly didn't adopt anything by motion and vote today. So at the risk of, maybe adding another meeting or holding the time that we already have, I'd be curious what other folks think.
We have a meeting tomorrow, Ben.
On tomorrow. Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were keeping that meeting or not. We are, okay.
So we have time held tomorrow from 9 to 12. And I was trying to balance between making sure you all got what you needed versus the agencies providing reports. So it might be helpful. I don't know, do you all want a update from those agencies you listed, Ben, via email, or do you want to hear them?
I don't have a preference one way or the other. Generally speaking, I do think that whereas we've had questions as part of the agency update, that I think that should be a conversation. So I think about ODA with the soil and water conservation. I think that's a conversation that we need to have, and it's not kind of like, here's what's happening. It's we would love your thinking on something. So I think whereas there's agencies that want to, agencies are looking for feedback, I think it's important to create that space. If there's agencies that just want to send a written paragraph or two about what they would otherwise verbally represent, that's fine.
Yeah, this is Bob, to bounce back a little bit to Amira's statement with that group and where Blueprint is going. It seems like Oregon Health Authority's Blueprint is the one that's catching the most energy now going forward. They've had EJ consultants that reference what we've done in terms of best practices. So we're really ahead of what any consultant could offer. as we're moving forward, Ben, to ask you to answer directly where they're at, we're going back, the state agencies are going back and see what they already do for climate equity. And correct me if I'm wrong, Amira. And so they're looking at some of the things they've done. And one of the things they go back to is our annual reports. You know, what have they done with EJ that they can count as going forward for climate equity? So I did want to underscore the value of the work that all the task force members, present and before, have done with those, and agencies, especially for those annual reports, is laying the groundwork to beginning internal state agency discussions about climate equity. So agencies, keep those reports coming. Thanks.
Other EJTF members will not provide some closing comments. See you, Hui. No, I'll just say that I think it'd be great if we can hear from agencies directly. Like, I don't know about y'all, but my inbox every day is just, it's ridiculous. So if we can spend some time tomorrow hearing directly from agencies, giving them an update, a verbal one, I'd appreciate that first touch. And then of course, if they have follow-up things to send us in writing, I'm happy to get it from them as well. But if possible, I'd love to get some agency updates tomorrow. Also, so we can have a conversation about it and deliberate and do other stuff we didn't get a chance to do today.
So I just want to be cognizant and considerate of the agency members' time today, because it does feel like the request for them to be here tomorrow is a little short notice. Are there specific agencies that you would like to see tomorrow? I'm hearing OHA and
OSHA.
And OSHA.
Yeah, OHA, OSHA, Department of Ag.
Department of Ag.
Q.
Anyone else? Right into our Christmas wish list. Those are the ones that's on my head. Also, if possible, I'd like to hear a little bit. I'll get an update about the 100-year water vision. I know that was work that was happening before COVID, but I'm curious to see what's happened to it now that we're in this new reality.
I can provide that right now, actually. So it's still kind of on hold.
I figured.
In the whole budget stuff, but we're trying to figure out how to advance specific things within the water vision forward. I can talk a little bit more about that tomorrow.
Okay.
And I'm wondering who could speak to us about the wildfire devastation and efforts in getting people back on their feet.
Yeah, that'd be good for tomorrow too, particularly when it comes to some of the areas that are really impacted. The Amida wildfire, you know, just getting an update about wildfire stuff in general tomorrow, Mira, would be really, I'd be really appreciative. Okay,
great. I can do that because I think our forestry reps might not be available tomorrow. So I'm
also, sure. Also, just disaster preparedness in general. Like, I think this has really triggered a conversation about disaster preparedness. I also know that the Oregon Board of Forestry is having deliberations on a, you know, west of the Cascades conservation plan. So there's a lot of stuff.
Yes, a lot is happening.
Yeah, a lot of stuff. But last call for comments, and then if not, we'll close out. Go once, go twice. Sold. All right, gang. Do I need a motion to convene? I always forget. I think we do, yeah?
I don't think so. I don't know that we ever have. We just shut it down.
We just leave, yeah?
Last time we just shut it down.
I mean, I can make a motion.
Robert's rules. Robert's rules to hell. Let's get out of here. All right, y'all. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.
Appreciate it, Joel. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Joel.